Good afternoon, everyone. Jody, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, sure. This is Jody Patterson. I'm the Client Care Manager with Oasis Solutions. I'm going to be facilitating the webinar this afternoon as we have quite a few attendees. A very hot topic apparently are the AP tips and tricks. So you may have seen in the pre-slideshow that we are going to be accepting questions throughout the webinar. Pam will occasionally pause and ask if there are any questions. I'm monitoring the questions window and will attempt to answer those as we go along or read them out for Pam to address. So please put your questions into the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel, and we will do our best to address those during the webinar. If not, if we can't get to everybody's questions, we'll follow up individually. So welcome again to the webinar, and I'm going to turn back over to Pam Scott, our Director of Client Services, who is presenting today. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you, Jody. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for, I believe this is our first Tips and Tricks webinar of 2019, so thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. As Jody mentioned, you will be muted during this presentation, but feel free to ask questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So we typically do something on accounts payable about once a year. So this time I'm trying to focus on things that I don't believe that we've covered over the past couple of years, but features that all users have an interest in, or maybe it's features that you're not aware of. So what we're going to do first is in accounts payable, I'm going to go under the setup and just go into the AP options and point out a couple of things to you. I'm going to go over to the Entry tab, and we're going to talk about on the left side, it says Batch Processing. In Batch Processing, you have the option for invoice data entry, or you have it for manual check and payment entry. We will get questions that will say, you know, I wish there was a way that I could have more than one AP person entering invoices in at the same time. Well, you can do that, and all you need to do is enable batch processing, and then you can have as many end users doing data entry in AP at the same time. So basically how that works is if you're using batch entry, when the person goes in to do a new invoice batch, it's going to require them to put in a batch number, which they can do, or they can even just type in their initials, because once you update a batch, you can reuse the same batch number over and over. So sometimes using your initials is an easy way to keep up with your batch versus someone else's. Also, it allows you that if I'm doing a batch, and let's say Jody is doing a batch, and I finish my work and I'm ready to run my invoice register and update it, I can do that, and it only affects my batch, and it will not affect anything that Jody is doing. So it still gives her the opportunity to finish her data entry, preview her reports, make sure everything is correct before she does an update. So I just wanted to point that out, that if you have multiple people that need to be able to enter at the same time, enabling batch entry is the way to accomplish that. The other thing that I wanted to show you, I'm going to go back to the main tab. Actually, I lied. I'm going to go to the additional tab. On the top right, you have number of days to retain paid invoices. And this field can have from 0 to 999 days. So if you're going in and you're looking in vendor maintenance and you're looking at the invoices tab and you see a whole list of your invoices in there, open invoices, paid invoices, they may go back a very long time. You can tell it how long you want to keep those paid invoices basically on that screen, or when to purge that information out of Sage. What causes it to purge is whatever you have set here. When you do, the next time you do period end processing, so if I left my setting at 99 days, the next time that I do period in processing in Accounts Payable, it's going to go out, it's going to take a look at any of my AP invoices that were paid more than 99 days ago, and it's going to then purge them off of that screen. It's really up to you how long you want to keep them. I certainly think 99 days is not enough time. I would probably do a year at a minimum. What a lot of clients do is you can set it to 999. And then if you realize that you have so much history that, keeping almost 3 years is just too much, you can go in at any time, and I could change that from 999 to 600 days. Could accept it. I can go do my period in processing. It will then purge anything that was paid more than 600 days ago. And then if I want to start keeping things from that point forward for 999 days, I literally need to go back into my options and just change this. Now, with that, if you accidentally purge out information that you didn't intend to, changing that number to a higher number is not going to bring back that history. So once you have removed that history, it is gone. So you want to just make sure that you have it set to an appropriate number. If you look throughout many modules within Sage, it will ask you how long you want to retain certain types of history. And doing that period in processing within those modules is what then will remove that data. So I just wanted to briefly touch on those two things in the Accounts Payable option. A little bit later in our presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about 1099s and managing that history within Sage. So if you are wanting to track 1099 history within your Sage software, in the AP options, if I go back to the main tab, this is where you indicate whether or not you want to start tracking the 1099 reporting. So if you've never tracked 1099s within Sage and you want to start doing that, it is not too late in the year to do that. You can go ahead and tell it that you want it to start reporting. And then we're going to take a look at how to set that up on a vendor and also how to make sure that the history is correct. You can go in and start putting in the totals of what you've paid them year to date, and then it will start calculating on top of that number. So again, 1099 reporting is under Accounts Payable options under the main tab. So we're going to leave the AP options screen, but I'm going to stay under the setup area. And we are going to take a look at the expense distribution tables. I'm not sure if many of you are aware that this table now exists in Accounts Payable, and it has been there for the past several versions. But let's say that you have invoices that are always expensed out maybe to multiple departments. So let's say, for instance, that you have rent that you pay or a lease, and you actually then expense that percentage of your rent per department based on, how much space they use or however you want to calculate that. You can set up an expense distribution table so that when you go to do an invoice data entry, you can apply that table and not have to then put all of those various lines broken out on the line detail. So let me show you an example of one that I've set up, and then we'll go into invoice data entry and take a look and see how that flows. So I set up one earlier called rent, and basically you give the table code a name, and then you put in a description, and then you pick your GL account numbers, and you put in the percentage that is going to be expensed to these various GL account numbers. Okay, and so I'm just going to click accept. To set one up, so let's say that we want to do one for utilities and phone. phone expenses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down and I will pick a GL account. We'll see if I have anything in here for phone, and I do not. So we will just grab anything in here for right now. Let's do this telephone expense. Here we go. So let's say that I want to break out each phone bill based on these different divisions within my company. So I can grab this first one, and we'll say that 10% of the bill goes against this department. And we want to grab this one, and we'll say that 15% goes against that department. And we'll say 35% goes against this department. So you can also see that it's doing a running total down here. So I'm going to grab another expense account, and we'll say this one is 50%. Whoops, sorry. We'll say this one is 30%. And we'll then grab this last account and say it is 10%. So you can see that I've listed how I want to expense this particular table, and then I'm going to click accept, and then it saves these tables in my expense distribution table list. If I need to go in and change a percentage, I can go in and select this and then just make changes to the percentage and recalculate it. So at this point, and then you can have as many of those as you want, and they are company specific. So if you have multiple companies within Sage, you can have distribution tables set up that are unique to each company. And then when you go in to do the invoice data entry, so I'm going to go into invoice data entry. Now I selected earlier in the setup options that I wanted to do batch entry. So this is the screen I'm getting. I can either click on the pound sign to assign the next batch number, or literally I could use my name or my initials and use that for my batch number. Because again, once I update my invoice register, that batch is removed and I can use Pam over and over. I'll tell you another actually good tip on using those batches is, let's say that your company is, maybe you only have one person doing invoice data entry, but you're very particular that your expenses hit the correct month. So maybe on the second day of the month, you're getting invoices in the mail that are actually March expenses, but you're still getting invoices that were truly February expenses. What you could do is you could have two different batches, one called Feb, one called March, and do the data entry of those invoices in the separate batches so that you can post them to the February batch to a February date and the March batch to a March date. If you try to update multiple batches, you will only have one posting date. But keeping that separate is also another good way to be able to do invoice data entry at the same time, because I've seen where people up until the 10th or 15th of the month, they just put that current month's invoices in a folder and then they're playing catch up. And that will, by using batch entry in that scenario, will allow you to be able to enter those at the same time. So before I go into let me show you one thing with the invoice data entry, and then it does look like that maybe we have a question. So what we're going back to is what I showed you on the expense distribution table. So I'm going to select my vendor, and I'm going to give it an invoice number, and I'm going to put in an invoice amount. So we'll say that this invoice is $1,000. On the right, it says expense distribution table. So let's pretend that this is for my telephone bill. So I'm going to do a lookup. I'll see any of my codes in there. I'm going to grab my phone expenses. And then when I go to the lines tab, it is actually going to then fill that in for me, and it breaks it out. Now, if on this particular invoice, I needed to remove a department and add money to another amount, I could literally click on this line, delete it, and then go up to this line and change the amount. It will not affect anything with the distribution table that I have set up. It's just going to change it on this particular invoice. But as you can see, if you typically break things out among multiple departments, it will save you some time entry. So the other thing that you can do is if you if you never know exactly how much is going to get expensed to each department, but it's always the same departments, you can set up the table and have your GL account numbers, but your amounts at 0, and at least it will fill that in, and then you can drop in the amounts when you do the data entry. So I'm going to stop now, Jody, if there's questions.
There are a couple of questions, and they're all kind of related to the expense distribution. Can you set up an expense distribution by dollar amounts instead of by percentages?
That is a good question, and I don't believe that you can. I will make a note and double check and follow up on that. I don't think you can do it by amount because in many scenarios that invoice is not going to be the same amount month after month. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Right. My phone bill this month may be $540.23, and next month it's $450.30. So that's where the percentages come in. Now, if someone is thinking, well, my phone bill is always $500 a month, and I always break it down the same way, I'm going to show you them shortly, repetitive invoice entry, and that would take care of that issue for them.
Thank you. That was the only question, asked a couple of different ways.
Okay, all right, thank you. So, and then after we get into repetitive invoice entry and I show everyone how that works, they may have additional questions about that, so we'll talk about that as well. So as you can see, it's just a way to save you from a lot of keystrokes. Some companies may have 15, 20, 30 different departments that need a percentage of that invoice that comes in, and to sit down and type each of those lines can get very time consuming. So I don't remember exactly what version that became available, but it has been there for several years. So just check in your setup and see if expense distribution table is listed. If it's not, then you probably are definitely due for an upgrade, so get in touch with us at that point. So before I move on to anything else, I just wanted to see if anybody else has any questions about that. No? Oh, go ahead.
There's a question. Oh, it's for when we get to the AP aging reports. So not yet.
Okay. All right. Well, let me make a note of that to talk about the AP aging. All right. Thank you. So with that, again, I was in just the regular invoice data entry. I'll go in and grab my batch. So just to kind of go through again, the one that I had set up for rent previously, I'll go through and show you if, again, just briefly run through, and I'm going to select my distribution table for rent. And again, it breaks it all out for me. If I want to just double check and make sure everything looks okay, click accept. And then at this point, when I'm finished, then you're just going to run your invoice register like normal, make sure it's okay, update it, and then do the print the daily transaction action register, and then update that as well. So wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that nifty feature in our Sage 100. So what we're going to talk about now, we're going to kind of tie into that with repetitive invoice entry. So in Accounts Payable, under your main menu, you have something called repetitive invoice entry. And what repetitive invoice entry, and this has been in Sage probably as far back as I can remember, and this goes back to probably version 3.0. You've been able to do repetitive invoice entry for things that are repetitive. So if each month you get in your mortgage bill, and your mortgage is always $1,000 a month, whether you're expensing it to one account or whether you're expensing it to 50, it's always $1,000 a month. Leases on vehicles. A lot of people have vehicles that they lease, or they may have a fleet of vehicles. So these are ways that you can track all of those, get them set up once, and then automatically, via the push of a couple of buttons, have Sage generate the invoice data entry for you. So I'm going to walk through an example, and then show you then actually how to create invoices from this. So if you're doing one from scratch, you're going to select your vendor, and you're going to give it a reference number. Now this is only 4 characters long, so you can't put in a real long description in that reference. So make it something that's easy for you to determine. If it is your mortgage payment, call it MTG. If it's rent, call it rent. What I suggest is, if you have a fleet of vehicles, let's say you have a bunch of service trucks, and you're paying, leases on those trucks, and there are different amounts and due different times. A lot of times your vehicles have vehicle numbers, or you've numbered those trucks. So let's say that your trucks are, 100 through 110. You could call one of them T for truck 100. And then after you set that up, then you'll set up the lease payment for truck 101, and you would have a reference called T101. It's going to ask you for a cycle. And if you notice, there's not a lookup here, so it doesn't maintain a list once you set up those cycles. What the cycle means is how often do you want to generate those invoices. And I suggest you do something very simple, but the thing is whatever naming convention you use needs to be consistent across the board. So if I'm paying on this truck on a monthly basis, then I would suggest that you use a cycle of M. So anything that you pay monthly would all have a cycle of M. If it's something that is annually, then you could use, an A for annual, a Y for yearly. If it's something that you pay weekly, use W for weekly. It can be whatever you want it to be, but you just need to make sure that you know the definition of that cycle, because when I'm generating these invoices, it's going to want to know what cycle I'm wanting to generate. It wants to know what your start billing date is. So if I leased a truck today and my first payment is not due until May the 1st, then I would change that start billing date to May the 1st of 2019. For the purposes today, to pull in the data, I'm going to just use today's date. It wants to know how many payments you have. So if this lease is a 24-month lease, then I'm going to put in that I have 24 payments. If I was paying this weekly, then over 2 months, then I might do that it's 104 payments. I'm going to put in the invoice amount. So this isn't the total of the lease. This is the how much each month I'm paying for this truck. So let's say that the payment is $500. And the terms code, basically, I can select, and I'm going to say it's just due upon receipt. I can put in what my original balance is. So let's say that this lease is a $12,000 lease. You don't have to do this, but I'll show you the neat thing about it once you get into it. So you can put in the original balance, and if it's subject to a 1099, this vendor is not. If it was subject to a 1099, this box would be available, and I could enter, if it's miscellaneous or business, and what the appropriate box is. Then I'm going to go to my Lines tab, and this is where I'm going to expense it. Now, if you notice, it dropped in a line here. The reason for that is I had a default GL account number in my vendor maintenance for IBM. If that default GL account number was blank, then when I go to the Lines tab, I'm going to just see this, and then I can pick whatever or as many accounts as I need to. And we'll just do one line entry here. And then I'm going to just accept this. I'm going to look on my flashlight right here, and this is my repetitive invoice list. So you can see the other repetitive invoices that I actually have in my system. So let's say that I've gone through and I've set up the repetitive invoices that I want to track. Then when I'm ready to actually generate those invoices within Sage, I go to Repetitive Invoice Selection, and I might as well just use this batch. And it's going to come up and it's going to say, okay, the invoice date is 3/13, which is today. Enter the selection date, and this is going to look to see it looks at your start billing date, and it looks at the last time billed to see if it falls within that category. So if I wanted to have anything entered that had a selection date between now and the end of the month, I could put in a 3/31/19 date, and it would select the invoices that I had just keyed in. This is where you select a cycle. And if I only want to do the ones that are monthly, I'm going to do equal to, and I'm going to type in an M. And you'll notice that a lot of times when you do selections in Sage, you have that little lookup list, that magnifying glass. You don't have that here. That's why you need to, again, remember what those cycles are. I could choose certain references. I could choose certain vendors. In my example right now, I just want to select any invoice, repetitive invoice, that falls within this criteria that has a cycle equal to M. So I'm going to click Proceed. It's going to go out in my system and look to see if it sees anything. So at this point, what it is doing behind the scenes is anything that met that criteria, it has created an invoice for me in AP Invoice Data Entry. So I could close out of this screen, and I could go into AP Entry and see those invoices, or I could go directly to my invoice register to print it to see if it's there and update. If I click the printer icon here, let me bring this up. It will, in just a second, or a few seconds, bring up my date, and I'm going to have to just fudge the date here because my demo data is in a future year. I'm going to preview this, and it actually takes me directly to the invoice register. And if you look, here are the invoices that it created. And what it does is it takes the repetitive invoice code and then puts the date behind it. So see, this is an example. Let me make this a little bit bigger for everybody to see. So this one that I set up for IBM, the repetitive code was rent. I used an invoice date of 3/13, so it generated an invoice number on its own using the date and the code. Next month, if I generate this invoice on April the 15th, my invoice number is going to be rent 04/15/19. So it's easy to tell when you go in and look in vendor maintenance. You can see those invoices, and it's very easy to tell what month they're for and what the repetitive invoice is for. Here's where you can see my truck, which was T100, and then it added the 3/13/19 after that. The other invoices that you're seeing here, these two are the ones that I showed you how to use the distribution table. And the others at the top are a couple that I created prior to the class today that I had not updated. So at this point, if everything looks okay, I would then update that invoice register and my daily transaction register, and it posts an invoice just like normal. So we're going to, there's my division recap. I'm not going to update it at the moment. I want to go back in and show you something. So I'm going to go back into repetitive invoice entry, and I'm going to pull up the one that we did for IBM. This rent, this is the one we did. Whoops, let me look at the next one. Okay, all right. So you'll notice that when I'm looking at this, nothing has changed on this screen. So if I go back to my invoice register, and we wait again for a minute, I'm going to just preview this quickly and update it. I'm going to take you back to that screen, and I'm going to show you the change that it made. Whoops. Yes, we want to update it. So now it's updating to Accounts Payable. And it should pop up in a second and ask me if I want to do the daily transaction register. Just for any of you that are attending today that are fairly new to Sage 100, everything outside of the general ledger module basically has two update processes that you go through. One updates the module that you're working in, and any other integrated modules. For instance, if you're using AP and you write checks and you're integrated with bank rec, updating that check register is going to then write that information to the bank reconciliation module. The daily transaction register is what's going to hit your general ledger. So there's always two steps with this. So what you should be doing is printing or previewing this really well and making sure it's in balance. So don't do what I'm doing as an example. So I'm going to update that. You definitely want to look at it and look at it closer. Okay, now we're going to go back into the repetitive invoice. I'm going to find my one for IBM for my truck. And if you notice now, it has filled in some blanks for me. So I put in the original balance of $12,000. It is showing me that I have so far billed $500 to date against this repetitive invoice. I have an unbilled balance of 11,500. It shows me the last time I generated an invoice and the number of times I billed it. So what this does is as you go through and you generate these and you update your invoices, when the number of times billed equals the number of payments, and let's say I forget that it's out there, and the next time I go to do an invoice for a monthly cycle, it will not generate an invoice for this because the number of times billed has equaled the number of payments, so it assumes that it's no longer going to need to generate an invoice. The original balance versus the billed to date and unbilled, that's just there for your purposes. That doesn't do anything to stop the invoice from being generated. It is this literally this times billed field. So that kind of walks you through how to do a repetitive invoice within Sage. So kind of going back to the question that someone had earlier about, can you just do amounts? If it's something that is the same amount every month, you could go through and have all of your, kind of build in your table here in the amounts, so that you would be using repetitive invoices versus the expense distribution table. The other thing is, if it could be a wide variety of amounts as you break it out, you could list all of your GL account numbers with 0 amount. When you generate the invoice in AP, then you would just pull that up in AP invoice data entry and fill in the amounts. So I'm not sure if that made sense. If anybody needs an example of that, let me know. And then I'll stop and ask Jody if anyone has any questions about this that we're looking at.
Pam, we do have a question about repetitive invoices and distribution tables. Do the comments on a repetitive invoice entry and the lines of the entry and expense distribution table, do those comments carry over when you turn that repetitive invoice into an invoice?
Yes, they should. I did not look at it in invoice data entry, but we can do another example really quick. So hold on for me just a second. We'll just do this so that it's comment. Whoops. Go back. It took me to the same screen, but let me just do it this way. It would have helped if I'd have put a comment on that, wouldn't it?
I was about to point that out.
Sorry, I got in a hurry. Comment.
And we also put, please put one on the header field as well, the header comment section, because I think that may be where they're asking about as well.
Okay.
Perfect.
That way we know where it's coming from. I was getting ahead of myself there. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do.
It did show it.
It did. Okay.
It was in that preview.
But let me pull it up in the batch itself. Maybe this one. All right, hold on a second. See, I got in a hurry and I goofed myself up here. Let me just cancel this. Oh, going to give me, wait, it's going to make me wait a second. Hold on just a minute for me. Sorry, guys. I believe the answer is yes, that it brings it over. Oh, I don't think it made the selection.
While Pam is running out that report to test that theory, which I also believe is 100% correct, yes, it does bring in the comments on both of those sections. Also wanted to point out that when you're doing your repetitive invoice selections, say that you've got things such as leases or rents that are due on the first of the month, you don't want to wait until the first of the month to run those. That's where that invoice selection date comes in handy as well. So you can actually date the invoices on the first of the month, but run them out, earlier than that so that you can get them paid on time.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, and it does, like I said, I didn't make the selection correctly a moment ago, but it does bring over both of those comments. So basically, all it's doing is allowing you to basically key that invoice in once into the system, and then tell Sage when you want it to make a copy of it in the invoice data entry. And for those of you that use accounts receivable, if you do your billing out of AR, you have a very similar feature in accounts receivable where you can do repetitive invoices, so that if you have a $50 service fee that you pay your clients, or that you bill your clients on a monthly basis, you can do that as well in AR. And then there's also ways to do repetitive things within the sales order module. So we won't be showing those today, but just so that you know that it's available in those modules as well. Any other questions on this before we move to something else?
Nothing left on this.
Okay. All right. All right. Another area that I wanted to show you, we tend to get a lot of questions on this, especially from new users within Sage. They will call our support desk and say that they need to void a check out of the system. And we're going to focus on voiding the definition of voiding and reversing checks out related to AP. This is in no way how you do it if you use the payroll module. We're focusing strictly on AP. But I wanted to talk to you about that Sage uses different terminology based on what you're wanting to do with a check. So the terminology in Sage to void a check assumes that it is an unused check that has never been recorded within Sage 100. So an example might be you are going to a new printer to order your check stock, and they need for you to send them a void check so that they know how your checks are laid out. Obviously you need to record that check number is void. You want it to show up in your bank recon as void. So I'm going to show you how to do that within Sage. Another thing is you've got your checks laying on your desk, and you accidentally knock your coffee over and saturate 3 of them that can never be used. You would want to void those within the system. A check reversal is the terminology used if you have generated a check within Sage, whether through manual check entry or the payment selection, and you have updated that, and it's listed as a written check within your system, and you need to back that out for any reason, that is considered a check reversal. So a reversal would be your vendor calls and the check got lost in the mail, so you need to reverse that check out and issue a new one. Maybe you accidentally paid a vendor when you didn't intend to. So that's the difference in the terminology. Everybody still calls it voiding a check. So when you call in and say you want to void it, we're going to drill down a little bit deeper and determine if it's an unused check that you need to record or if it's a check already in the system that you need to reverse out. So to record a voided check is probably one of the easiest things you can do within the system. So I'm going to go into manual check entry and payment entry. Make sure you have the correct bank code selected, that the type is a check, and you're going to put in the check number. So if I'm wasting my next check on the list, I can just click on next check number and look and make sure that's the right number. At this point, it populates a check date, and all I'm going to do is hit my enter key. I'm going to enter through each of these fields, and when I haven't filled anything in, it says, is this a void check? So if you're ever doing this in Sage, and it comes up and asks you this, then obviously either you forgot to fill in this information if you're doing a real manual check, but if it's a void check, I'm going to say yes. And then I still need to update my manual check register. There's no journal entry associated with it, but it's going to record that check as void in my history and also in my bank reconciliation. So that literally is all you have to do to void an unused check. If you are wanting to reverse a check, let me walk you through one of those, but let me get an example to make sure that I'm using a true check number. And 1611. Okay. So I'm still going to reverse a check. I'm still going to go into manual check entry. And I'm going to put in the check number 1611, and I'm going to hit enter. And that did not do what it was supposed to do. Hold on just a second. It should have popped up and asked if it was a check reversal. So it did not. And the reason that it did not is because I was doing the manual check entry in bank code D, and this check was written out of bank code A. So I will go back into my manual check entry. And I'm going to change this to my bank code A. Okay, so it recognizes that this check number exists in bank code A. And it comes up and says, is this a check reversal? So what I tell people is if you're in manual check entry and you key in a check number and it pops up, is this a reversal? You probably should have one of two answers. Yes, I'm trying to reverse a check, or oops, I typed in the wrong number. Because if I say no to this, Sage will allow me to duplicate a check number, and you really do not want to do that. So since I am reversing a check, I'm going to say yes. And then, in just a minute, it should pop up and say, do I want to recall invoices paid by this check? So let me give you a couple of examples. So let's say that this check was sent to my vendor and it got lost in the mail, and I need to reissue a check. Since I'm going to repay the invoice that was in Sage, I would say yes, that I want to recall the original invoices. So when I update this, it will reverse out my check. It reopens that invoice on my vendor so that I can pay it again. A lot of people say, well, I don't know, I keyed the invoice on the wrong vendor to begin with, so I don't want to reopen that invoice. My recommendation is that you always recall the original invoice, and that if you keyed that invoice on the wrong vendor, then you go in and do an invoice adjustment to adjust that, to back that invoice out, because then you have an audit trail. You're going to see where the invoice was entered. You're going to see where the check was written and it had the invoice has a zero balance. You're going to see where the check was reversed and the invoice was reopened. And then you're going to see where you adjusted that invoice off. So you're going to be able to see the entire audit trail. If you say no to this, then it just reverses that check out, but you can't really tell whatever happened to that invoice. So I like being able to go through and see exactly what happened, or if I'm going back and trying to research something, it's going to be a lot easier if you have that entire audit trail. So I'm going to say yes to this. So what it does is it puts in what my check date was, the amount, the vendor, and then if you go to the Lines tab, this was actually just evidently written to a GL account and not an invoice, so bad example, but it's actually going to put my invoice in there as well. So, and then once I update the check register and I go in and I look at that vendor, then I'm going to see that the check has been reversed. And then I'm going to see that that invoice has a balance once again so that I can pay it. So again, I picked a bad example here with this demo data, but with your live data, you would have been paying an invoice that existed in your system, and it is highly recommended that you recall it. So does anybody have any questions on that, Jody?
There is a question on voiding checks. If you have more than one check to void, can you batch enter them, or do you have to enter them individually? You
do have to enter them individually. There is no way that I'm aware of that you can batch enter them.
But to take that one step farther, you can enter them sequentially within the same batch. You don't have to update the batch one after another.
Oh, correct. That is correct. You can't just say void check 1 through 52.
Got it. No other questions on that.
Okay. Well, those were the items that I was going to review today. And you mentioned earlier that someone had a question on the AP aging. So I'd like to go ahead and address that now, please.
Okay. The question on AP aging is, how do you reprint prior month's reports?
That's a good question.
And we may need clarification on that.
Yeah. I think I'd like to know what the scenario is on why you would need to do that. If that
was your question, if you can ask again and clarify what you're trying to see, what data you're trying to report on, maybe we can figure out how to answer that one.
Right. Because typically, I don't know that I've ever had anybody that needed to go back and print them from previous dates. So yeah, if they could just clarify that question, that would be great. I'll open it up to anyone else. If anyone else has any questions about what we covered today, go ahead and please fill those in before we end. And while you all are thinking about it, I just want to tell everyone that our next Tips and Tricks webinar is on Wednesday, April the 10th. It's at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we will be talking about purchase order on that day. Everyone will be getting an email notification so that they can register. Also, you will be getting email notification very soon with a save the date for our 2019 Sage 100 End User Group meeting, which is going to be held on Thursday, June the 27th. some more information will be forthcoming regarding that event as well. And then also, if you haven't already heard from me, if you're on an expired version or retired version of Sage 100, or a version that will be retired in September of this year, I've been sending out emails to everyone to make you aware that you need to be considering an upgrade this year. So please do not put that off. It's already mid-March, and we're already looking at a 4 to 6 week lead time because of the number of requests that we've received. So you don't want to wait until November and decide you want to try to upgrade before the end of the year. So just try to be proactive with that. So did they clarify anything, Jody?
Yes, we do have clarification on that.
Thank you.
I get lost in the questions. Here it is. The hard copy of the AP aging report was lost, and they wanted to rerun it, but when they reran it, it had a different total.
Correct. I don't believe, I'm just trying to think if there's any way at all that could be done.
Perhaps if you change the system date?
No, because if those invoices have already been paid, I don't think it's going to grab them at all. So
even if you change the invoice date, the system date to the date that you originally ran that AP aging report?
Based on how I think the report runs, I don't think I don't think there's a way to do that. However, Jody, if you will make a note of who that is and their email, I will research a little further and see if there is a way. I don't believe this is one of the reports that is saved in the paperless office functionality. I know that it does keep some reports and registers, but I don't believe this is one of them. So if you can, if whoever asked that question, if you could give us an example of how far back, was it last month's aging report that was misplaced, or was it, one from 3 or 4 months ago? That will be helpful as well. And then the only thing that I would suggest from this point forward, especially if the answer is no, you can't go back and do it. If you want to keep those, is that anytime you generate an aging report, you can either export that out to Excel and keep that file, or you could export it out directly to a PDF and just keep PDF copies of your aging reports. So that's really, really easy to do. If I wanted to grab my aging, I'm just going to preview here. And then I'm going to go up and click on this icon on the top left to export report. I could say that I wanted to export it to a PDF format, and then it'll actually allow me to browse out to where I want to keep that document. And I probably then would add the date so that I could, keep track of them. But you could do that starting at this point and always know that you have one to go back to. But I am not aware that you can do that, but I can't say that I've ever tested it, but we can certainly do that. So we will follow up with you, and but if you can let us know how far back it is, that probably is also going to make a big difference.
Okay, we'll follow up on that one offline. There is a related question. Is there an AP aging report you can run that is by posting date instead of invoice date? Is that one of those options on the aging screen?
It depends on the version. It used to not be at all. If the question is wanting to run it based on the posting date so that your trial balance balances your GL detail, that may be one of the reasons that they're wanting to run that report. I would suggest that you run the AP trial balance, because the AP trial balance is based on the posting date. The aging report is based on the invoice date. So that's where you could have a discrepancy between your general ledger and your AP. If my invoice was dated March 31st, and my GL posting date I used was April 1st, then my aging report is not going to match my GL. But if I ran my trial balance as of 4/1, then it would match it should match what is in the general ledger. So those two should always tie. The aging report may not balance to the GL detail. So we can you can age it by invoice date or due date. So I don't believe that you can. I know definitely in the older versions it was not an option at all. But if you're trying to balance to the general ledger, then you need to be running the AP trial balance. Again, the trial balance is based on the posting date, not the invoice date. So
that was the reason for that question.
Okay.
It looks like they were hoping that the trial balance would have the aging buckets. Unfortunately, it sounds like you do have to run them separately, one for trial balance purposes and one for aging purposes.
Correct. And then if your AP trial balance does not match your general ledger, then you do have an issue somewhere and you need to figure out why. And typically that's because someone maybe made a journal entry against your AP account, and that's why it's not reflected in the AP trial balance. And I know that auditors get in an uproar because they want that aged invoice report to match. One of the things you can do with an aged invoice report is you could run it out to the end of time and say age invoices as of 12/31/29/99 and run your GL detail for the same date, and then they should tie in together. Anything else?
Do you have enough time for another question?
Certainly.
Okay, it's back on reversing checks. What do you do if you don't want to recall the AP invoices on a reverse check because payment will not be reissued to the vendor? Do you still select yes to recall?
Technically, you do not have to. Again, I prefer, if I'm doing it, I'm going to recall that invoice and then adjust it off so that I have the audit trail. If you don't recall it, your general ledger will be fine. But if you go in and look at the vendor, you're going to see the invoice, the payment, the check reversal, but the invoice still shows a zero balance. So if someone's coming in behind you, or an auditor is wanting to say, well, how did that happen? It's a little bit harder to explain. So the short answer is you don't have to recall it, but if it was me, I would. So it's really up to you.
Okay, I think there's one last question. And
okay.
Does this webinar today qualify for CPE credits?
It probably does. If you want to make a note of their name,
got it.
Let me ask the question: are they if they're in Kentucky, if they're located and licensed, have their CPA licensure in Kentucky, it definitely should. If they're in another state, it really depends. We are not, I think the term is NASBA certified, but for Kentucky, they will accept the CPE information.
Okay.
And sometimes Tennessee will accept it and sometimes they won't. So if you want to just make a note of that person as well, Jody, if they are in Kentucky, we certainly can email them a CPE certificate for this session.
Okay, perfect. That is the end of the questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We ran a little over, but thank you for sticking with us, and hope to you can attend the one for purchase order if you do use the PO module next month, and we'll talk about how it integrates and ties into accounts payable. And if you have any questions about anything else, upgrades, any Sage-related issue, feel free to reach out to me or Jody, and we'll be glad to get your answers or your questions answered. So we will go ahead and end today's session, and thank everyone for attending. Bye.
Thank you so much, Pam. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.